Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
President Trump considers additional support for Ukraine as Washington remembers Lindsey Graham. Welcome to the Tuesday edition as the president meets today with Volodymyr Zelenskyy at the White House, as well as Benjamin Netanyahu, both in town for Graham's funeral, set to begin a short time from now. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz. She's back today in Washington. Kailey, these meetings are focusing the president's attention directly on the two hot wars underway.
Yeah, although there does seem to be, at least for now, once again, a detente between the U.S. and Iran. No active firing is taking place in and around the Strait of Hormuz. This has been the case for several days now, and the oil market is reflecting that as we are seeing a plunge in prices. Brent crude now back below $84 a barrel. All that's to say, though, that it's not clear how the diplomatic process is going to move forward in that war. Meantime, in the Ukraine war, it's not just the White House meeting that Zelenskyy took while in Washington today after the funeral of Lindsey Graham at the National Cathedral. He's going to head to Capitol Hill to meet with senators who are getting set to vote on a Russia sanctions package,
which will carry Lindsey Graham's name officially, something we'll be tracking a bit later on in the day. It is expected to pass easily. Unclear if they'll get the unanimous consent that some were looking for, Kailey, but this is a very emotional day in Washington with this service taking place, and the way that it might feed into geopolitics is going to be something to watch.
Yeah, it's very unique to see an individual memorialized, not just here in Washington among a domestic political audience, but with so many world leaders in attendance as well. It's not just limited to the Israeli prime minister or Ukrainian president. We'll be covering that for you throughout this hour. But we also want to check in on the markets. As I mentioned, oil prices are dropping. That means yields are lower, but there's a whole lot happening in the equity market, including with semiconductors. So let's get a check on that now as we turn to Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kailey Leinz. Welcome back. You hit on two of the four major themes today, oil and semis selling off. But in addition to that, we've also got tech earnings coming up for the Mag 7 over the next couple of days. And yes, there's a Fed meeting underway right now. Decision tomorrow, 2 o'clock Wall Street time. Going to begin with crude oil. You mentioned the sell-off in WTI, $78.81 a barrel now. Crude down 4.6%. Barrel of Brent, $83.59, lower now by 5.4%. Bottom line here, oil lower, stocks higher, but semis are a major weak spot. The S&P 500 index up 38. We now stand at 74.51. That is a gain of 0.5%. The Dow up 1.3% right now. Among some of the Dow names, Sherwin-Williams, Salesforce, IBM, and Boeing all moving higher. Sherwin-Williams, by the way, after earnings, it is climbing now by just about 8.2%. NASDAQ up 0.2%, but the NASDAQ 100 index, the weak spot today, down 0.5%. Semis moving lower. The SOX, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange Semiconductor Index, down now by 3.6%. Your 2-year at 4.26%, with a 10-year currently trading at 4.59%, and the 30-year 5.08%. Again, all of this ahead of the Fed decision tomorrow and Kevin Warsh's news conference, 2:30 p.m. Yeah, count on Bloomberg. We'll have it for you live. Spot gold now at 4,037 the ounce, down 0.9%, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 4.6%, 78.78 a barrel. Weakness in semis, Micron down 8.4%, Intel now down by 5%, Advanced Micro Devices lower by 7%, bucking the trend. Nvidia, that stock higher by just about 0.6%. Lots going on. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Lots going on indeed, and Charlie Pellet's on top of it all. Thank you, Charlie, as always, watching the markets for us from New York. As we've told you here in Washington, it is also a day in which a lot is going on, all of it taking place on the day of the late Senator Lindsey Graham's funeral. There were, of course, some ceremonies at the Capitol building earlier today, and there will be a full memorial service for him taking place at the National Cathedral this afternoon. And in attendance at that service will be heads of state, not just leaders of Congress, in which Lindsey Graham spent so many years. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, of course, is here in Washington, as we've told you, as is the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, both of whom met with President Trump at the White House earlier today. Those meetings have now concluded, and the messaging, at least from the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, while brief in nature, Joe, was that they went well.
Yeah, really something to watch the images if you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube. The ceremony at the Capitol resolving to a memorial service that'll start about an hour from now at National Cathedral. That's why they had to get those meetings in early at the White House. And we're lucky to have Skylar Woodhouse with us, a Bloomberg White House correspondent with her eyes on both conflicts and both meetings today. Skylar, thanks for coming to see us here in our Washington bureau. The Zelenskyy meeting we'll seize on first. That actually went pretty quickly here, and he's got a couple of big asks that sound familiar, including more defensive systems, but more support from Washington, period, as we work our way up to a sanctions vote later today. The stars appear to be aligning for Zelenskyy here.
Yeah, President Zelenskyy, he said that the meeting with President Trump was, quote, a good meeting. So only time will tell to see, how well those discussions went today. I think for reporters who were over at the White House today, they definitely were, eager to get in the room to ask questions. And the meeting did not open up today, nor did the meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So I still think we're waiting for some of those true details, especially from President Donald Trump, and waiting to see if we'll get any sort of readout to learn more about those fine terms and what we can see going forward and how this relates to that sanctions bill.
Yeah, and we'll be watching the True Social feed, certainly. Skylar, it's interesting as we consider these two meetings and the position the leaders find themselves in relation to President Trump. There was a time in the not so recent past or distant past where Zelenskyy seemed to be really on the outs with not just the president, but others in the administration, including Vice President J.D. Vance. It does seem that relationship has gotten warmer at the same time that for Prime Minister Netanyahu on his 8th visit to this White House has been kind of publicly feuding with the president. Do we have any sense as to whether Netanyahu was able to ingratiate himself a bit more back into the fold?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's interesting is while President Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu were meeting, we did get some photos of the two leaders, of the leaders on or the officials on both sides. It's trying to sort of depict maybe a cozy environment. The two leaders were smiling. But, I think it'll be interesting to obviously see what that actually means and how, the two leaders are going to take the next step with the Iran war. Obviously, leading up to this meeting, there were a lot of reports and so forth around the president using some heavy language as it related to President Benjamin Netanyahu in phone calls and conversations. So I think there's a lot of questions still swirling on what the relationship is like and how it will be going forward.
Interesting analysis from Bloomberg's Dan Williams earlier, who saw those photos that were put out from the Israelis. Pete Hegseth was in there, I believe, along with other officials, suggesting this is a meeting of import. Whether this is a détente of some sort or a breakup remains to be seen. The president's going to speak at the service today. Are we going to hear from him at National Cathedral?
Yeah, I believe he will be speaking later today. It'll be interesting to see what sort of direction he goes.
But
obviously,
also his mindset as he says farewell to a friend who was pushing both of these causes. Right?
Absolutely, and especially former Senator Lindsey Graham. I mean, he was coming back from. Where was he? He was
Kyiv.
He was in Ukraine. So it'll be interesting to see how what kind of tone the president strikes today, and if he will reveal maybe any details from the meeting with Zelenskyy today. But certainly it'll be one thing to watch for sure as the president sort of says goodbye to a close ally of his.
Watching Truth Social.
Indeed, we will. All right, Bloomberg, Skylar Woodhouse helping us cover the White House. Thank you so much. And as Skylar mentioned, it was Ukraine that Lindsey Graham had just returned from just prior to his death. And it's on Ukraine we want to focus now as we turn to Melinda Haring, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and is back with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Melinda, welcome back. And we have a lot we want to discuss with you in terms of the actual conflict in Ukraine. But I would wonder your take first on the legacy of the late Senator Lindsey Graham and what he meant for Ukraine, for Ukrainian leadership, given his relationship with Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and how he possibly, via the sanctions bill that he helped author and negotiate around and push forward, could alter the course of this war.
Thanks for having me back on. So I think Senator Graham would be delighted today. He went to Ukraine 10 times since the war started. His last trip was to Ukraine. his heart was in Kiev. He had a close relationship with Volodymyr Zelenskyy. And I think it's important to say that Lindsey Graham wasn't just focused on Ukraine. He cared about free people around the world. So he had a heartbeat for the struggle for global freedom. But Ukraine was very, very special to him. And we see his death has released a lot of energy. There's a strong desire to do something to honor his hard work. There's been a desire to pass another bill that would sanction Russia, and it's named after the late senator, and it looks like that's going to pass on Capitol Hill today.
So what's that going to mean, Melinda? Welcome back. I just wonder the impact of that sanctions bill passing, because it does appear to be on a glide slope here. Whether or not it receives a unanimous consent agreement is another matter. But the president's going to have some new tools here. There are questions about the extent to which he will use them. What do you believe?
Right. Joe, so there is a question about whether he will use them, how good they are. They're not a 10. I'm not going to come on here and look you in the eye and say that the bill's fabulous, but it's a lot better than nothing. So remember, this is an administration that has done nothing on Ukraine since it came back to office. So this is fantastic. But I think more significantly, it will unlock the EU and push the EU to release its next package of sanctions. That's why it's significant.
I see.
Well, so then when we consider the significance of the decision making that this will force Vladimir Putin into, Melinda, if at all, if not, even if it is just a symbol that the U.S. is willing to stand by Ukraine in a more firm manner than it perhaps, to your point, has so far during this administration, where would you be looking for signs that it is starting to affect the behavior of the Kremlin and the way in which Putin is conducting himself as this war continues?
Great question. So it's not a great day in Moscow. There's a lot of things that are bothering Vladimir Putin right now. The first thing that's bothering him are Ukraine's long-range strikes. Ukraine is getting better at hitting oil refineries. It is causing the prices to go up. It's causing fear in people. There's elite fights within Moscow between the inner circle around Putin. So things are not rosy in Moscow, and he has upcoming elections. He also doesn't have enough people. We're seeing pictures of all the heads of state in Washington, and the Finnish president is here. And he's been very, very clear that Russia has a math problem. So Russia does not have enough soldiers to continue this war, and Putin cannot engage in a big mobilization, or he has a political problem. Right now, the ratio is every 5 soldiers that are killed on the Russian side, 1 Ukrainian soldier is killed. So things are not rosy in Moscow, and I don't think people realize that Putin is actually in a bit of a pinch right now.
Pretty big score for Zelenskyy on his way over to the United States. He stopped by the UK and posted from the Portsmouth Naval Base in the United Kingdom that the UK has decided to share what they call its stone cloak technology. That's a system that jams Russian air defense systems, to your point, allowing Ukraine to go deeper into Russian territory. And it begs the question, Melinda, the extent to which Ukraine is relying on the United States as opposed to its European partners.
So, Joe, great question. Since Trump has come back into office, the United States has not given any more military aid. It has delivered some military aid that the Biden administration arranged, but it hasn't given anything new. So we've been sitting on our hands since Trump came back into office. However, the U.S. is still providing intel support, and that's a really big deal. The Ukrainians rely on that intel support for these long-range strikes. So that has to continue in order for Ukraine to prosecute the war.
So the intel support, the licensing of Patriot missiles, which we know were discussed today, Melinda, what else does Ukraine then need from the United States?
So we really need to see the United States go and put another assistance bill into place. The United States hasn't given a large amount of money to Ukraine since 2024. It was April 2024. Ukraine needs more funds in order to keep the war in place. But its most immediate need is air defense. So just in the month of July, the New York Times calculated how many ballistic missiles have been sent into Ukraine. It's 117. and they don't have enough Patriots. Patriots are the only things that can down these ballistic missiles. And just to remind your viewers, ballistic missiles are hitting schools, churches, and ordinary citizens. And we're seeing the number of civilians at an all-time high this month as a result of that increased pressure with these ballistic rockets in Ukraine.
Wow. Missiles for the Patriots are needed literally every day. The quote from Zelenskyy in a post on X. Melinda, to your point, he was talking with the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, also here for the services today, where they discussed the prospect of diplomacy. Zelenskyy suggesting that important meetings for next month are being prepared. What's he talking about?
So what he's talking about is there's going to be a renewed effort to bring a peace agreement to the war in Ukraine, finally. And I think we're going to see Witkoff and Kushner come to Kiev. So they have been invited multiple times. They refuse to go. Witkoff in particular doesn't want to go because, Joe, there are no airports that work in Ukraine. You have to fly into Warsaw or fly into Moldova and then take a car or a train. And it's very uncomfortable. And Witkoff's not a young man. So General Kellogg used to make this trip all the time. But our chief negotiators on Ukraine haven't been to the country. That's a big problem. So I think out of this meeting, it was a very good meeting in the Oval Office. We see Zelenskyy and Trump, warm smiles, shaking hands. And it feels like we're back in a good place. But I think we're going to see more emphasis on negotiations. And I think the president is going to send his chief negotiators there. And I think the Laura Loomer visit definitely helped with that. But that wasn't the only thing that has set us in this place.
Yeah, Laura Loomer now on the side of Ukraine is one of the more remarkable political evolutions that we've witnessed as of late. Melinda, I also want to ask you, you mentioned how it's not a great day in Moscow, that Putin is facing difficulties domestically. I wonder if we should be considering what domestic pressures President Zelenskyy is also facing. He fired his popular defense minister. There's been turnover in Ukraine's military leadership. What is the impact of that?
Great question. Yes. So last week, there was big news in Kiev. The very popular defense minister, his name is Mikhailo Fedorov, and he's 35 years old. He's been in office since 2019. He's been promoted. He's a rock star. He's responsible for Ukraine's transformation. So if you take your phone, you can register your baby online. You can get married and divorced online in Ukraine. It's even better and faster than Estonia. And it's because of this defense minister.
Wow.
So he's fabulous. And no one understands why he was fired. So Zelenskyy didn't really answer the question. And there have been protests across the country. He's a nerd. I know him. He's not someone who toots his own horn. He doesn't speak English. He's from the sticks of Zaporizhia. He's from occupied Ukraine. But his trust numbers were growing, and Zelenskyy doesn't like to be overshadowed. We've seen this movie over and over again. You know, it happened with his commander-in-chief, with Zaluzhny, and he sent Zaluzhny to London. But he got rid of Fedorov because there was a real conflict between the Minister of Defense, Fedorov, and the Commander-in-Chief, Syrskyi. Syrskyi was old school. He was in his 60s. They called him a dinosaur. They called him the butcher of Kiev. He wanted to mobilize as many people and fight in sort of old Soviet tactics. And Fedorov wanted to use technology. And he wanted to revolutionize the armed forces. And the two of these guys couldn't communicate. And Zelenskyy said that he had to be in the room in order to get them to communicate. So Zelensky's defense is, I don't have time for this. I had to fix this problem. Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief, has been fired. Fedorov is no longer part of the government, and they're still negotiating, but there's still protests. So watch this space.
She's an encyclopedia on this stuff and has been to Kyiv countless times, unlike the negotiating team. Melinda, it's great to have you back. We'll see what comes from today's meeting and from the services that will follow. And we'll have an update on the sanctions, the Russia sanctions vote, likely tomorrow, as that's going to happen much later in the day, into the evening, following Zelenskyy's address to senators. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Thanks again to Melinda Haring at the Atlantic Council. We'll assemble our political panel next. We've got a good one today. Jeanne, Zaino, and Sarah Chamberlain on the way in as we turn our attention to the memorial service and the votes that will follow, only here on Bloomberg.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got a stock market rally underway for the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ higher by under 0.1%, but the weakness remains in big tech names. The NASDAQ 100 index is now lower by 0.6%, particularly weak semiconductors. Hard hit again today with the SOX, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange's semiconductor index. It is down now by 4%. But the S&P up 0.4%. The Dow is surging. Sherwin-Williams giving a big lift to the Dow Industrials. Right now, the Dow up 1.3%. The NASDAQ 100 index down 0.6%. Again, the SOX bears repeating, down by 4%. All of this with the VIX right around 18. The 2-year at 4.26%, 10-year 4.59%, and the 30-year 5.08%. Gold at $4,038 the ounce. Spot gold down 0.9%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 4.5%. WTI now sliding to $78.90 a barrel. Brent $83.80 barrel of Brent down by 5.2%. Earnings news: JetBlue shares are surging, now higher by 12.6% after earnings. It reaffirmed its full-year outlook and set a new long-term goal for 2028. A strong demand helped offset high fuel prices. All airlines are rallying today. American up by 2.7%, United up 3.1%, Delta up by 2.9%. They're all getting a lift from lower oil prices. Hilton Worldwide reported second quarter earnings that beat expectations. Demand improved across a range of price segments, but Hilton shares down 2.6%. Marriott, which reports August 3rd, Marriott shares down by 1%. Recapping, S&P now higher by 0.4%, with the SOX down 4%, and West Texas Intermediate crude slumping 4.4%. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, we appreciate that. Fascinating market today, and we'll have more on the markets when we connect with Charlie once again in about 20 minutes' time here on Balance of Power. Thanks for making Balance of Power part of your Tuesday here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We've got our eyes on the White House today, where the president is preparing to leave the mansion and make his way up to National Cathedral for the funeral services, the memorial services being held today for the late Senator Lindsey Graham. He will not be the only world leader there. In fact, it's been a very busy day at the White House. Meetings with Volodymyr Zelenskyy of Ukraine, as we've told you, and Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel. As we wait to hear headlines from those meetings, we want to bring in Tyler Kendall, Bloomberg's Washington correspondent, is on the North Lawn right now as the president prepares to load into those vehicles that you see behind her if you're on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube. To the extent that we understand, Tyler, I know reporters were not inside these meetings. Give us a sense of what was being discussed and how this all plays into the theme of the day, knowing Lindsey Graham supported these efforts to support Ukraine as well as to continue the war effort against Iran.
Right, Joe, there are so many threads that we could tie together at this point as we wait for the motorcade behind me to depart and President Trump's expected remarks later this afternoon at the funeral of Senator Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham's legacy, of course, such a large part of it is the fact that he had the president's ear and was a close advisor when it comes to foreign policy and was considered to be a foreign policy hawk. And you had these two leaders here today meeting at the White House that are here in Washington because they were considered to be such close allies with the senator. On the Ukrainian front, we heard from Zelenskyy. We haven't quite gotten that official readout from the White House yet, but we know that the Ukrainian president asked the U.S. for more air defense systems, including Patriot missile batteries, something that the president told us reporters yesterday on Air Force One he would like to keep for the U.S. at the moment amid dwindling stockpiles, though the U.S. did grant that general license so that Ukraine can produce their own. The White House told us that today's meetings was part of an effort to kickstart the negotiation process again when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, considering that that conflict has and those talks have been stalled at this point for months. And then on the Iranian side, on the Israeli side, we did get some headlines out of Netanyahu's spokesperson saying that the U.S. and Israel are fully aligned when it comes to Iran, and we wait to see what happens next in the conflict. Of course, Joe and Kailey, as you both know, we are currently in this pause in the fighting as the U.S. says that they are resuming negotiations, but our own reporting indicates it is really Iran and Oman that are talking about a potential deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz before we can even get to any sort of talks about what potential curbs on Iran's nuclear program would look like. All priority right now is on getting commercial shipping back up and running.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House for us, where again, President Trump is getting set to depart en route to the National Cathedral for the memorial service of the late Senator Lindsey Graham. Tyler, thank you so much. And when it pertains to the memorial service for Lindsey Graham, it of course is not the first ceremony we are seeing on his behalf today. There was also one held at the U.S. Capitol earlier this morning, attended by many of Graham's former colleagues, including his former colleague, now Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, who remembered him this way.
He saw that the Senate, at its very worst, could be a venue for character assassination. But because he loved people, he saw that the Senate, at its very best, could be a deliberative body geared towards persuading people. So I choose to remember Lindsey Graham as a man who could disagree with you without being disagreeable. I choose to remember Lindsey Graham as a person who could fight with you on one issue, but fight for you on another issue.
And as we remember the legacy of Senator Graham, we turn now to our political panel. Jeanne Zaino is with us, Bloomberg politics contributor, Democratic analyst, and democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, joined today by Sarah Chamberlain, a Republican strategist and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. Sarah, to come to you first, as so much of Washington and the world, frankly, remembers Lindsey Graham today, in the United States Senate, in the United States Congress, how many more of Lindsey Graham's ilk are there?
Unfortunately, not many left. I mean, whatever you thought of him, he was really a statesman. He reached across the aisle, worked with the Democrats. It's unfortunately, there's few and far between, especially after this next round of retirements.
Reminds me somewhat of the funeral of the late Senator Ted Kennedy, where you see a lawmaker drawing world leaders as if it was a presidential funeral almost. But the line that we just heard from J.D. Vance really says a lot. A person who could fight with you on one issue, but fight for you on another. Is that why he was friends with so many Democrats?
Absolutely. And he was there in a lot of their issues.
Yeah.
And he was the whisperer to President Trump.
Yes.
I mean, if the Democrats went to deliver a message to President Trump and didn't
Lindsey.
want to go to the media, they went to Lindsey Graham. And Lindsey Graham called up the phone and told the president. He will be very much missed. Whatever you thought about him, he was a very much a senator, a statesman, and both sides will miss him. It's such a tragedy.
Well, and as we consider the liaison he was for Democrats, the liaison he was for Senate leadership with the White House, he also was one for other world leaders. Hence the presence today, Jeanne, of the Ukrainian president, of the Israeli prime minister at his memorial services and in meetings at the White House. How should we consider the way in which the U.S.'s foreign policy and the reaching out to leaders of other democracies that Lindsey Graham did on behalf of the United States, and what will be missing in his absence?
Yeah, I mean, we have experienced the loss of probably the most pro-Israeli and pro-Ukrainian voice, certainly in the Senate and Congress as a whole. I'm not sure we know who can take up that mantle, if anyone, particularly his hawkish views, his protection, and his interest in expanding democracy around the world at a time when democracy is very much under fire. You know, we hear voices, perhaps Laura Loomer can take up this with Ukraine. I'm not sure that carries the same weight at this point. And that's who Lindsey Graham was. And it's a very unusual position for a senator to be in. And he was in it because he carefully put himself in that position. If we go back to 2016, he and Donald Trump were great adversaries. And he worked very, very carefully to gin up a relationship with Donald Trump that seems to have been real, because he knew if he had any hope of moving Donald Trump, particularly on foreign policy, and they were complete adversaries in that realm, that he had to be friends with him and be on the golf course with him and be in the room with him. And he did that successfully, maybe to the detriment of Donald Trump at home, but he did that successfully. And we saw that exactly 5 months ago when the president started this war, which Lindsey Graham was a major proponent of.
We're seeing some shots from inside the National Cathedral now, some live video. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, Benjamin Netanyahu was just speaking with the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth before they took their respective seats here, and seeing Mike Pence spend some time with Volodymyr Zelenskyy. There is Justice Kavanaugh as well, and Ken Vote, as we look at some of the Jamieson Greer as well, members of the administration who are in the room here. Sarah, it's not often you put everyone in a room like this on a solemn occasion. The emotions that are going to be felt when the president's speaking is something that everyone here can share. To what extent is this funeral going to help propel the issues that Lindsey Graham supported?
Well, I certainly believe it's going to, it's sad to say, help Ukraine. I mean, we know that they're meeting this afternoon, early this evening, and I think that we will see more funding going to Ukraine, more support going to Ukraine, because I do think when the president got iffy on Ukraine, it was Lindsey Graham who's like, listen, we have to continue to support Ukraine. Ukraine is very important. We cannot let Russia take over Ukraine, because then the dominoes could fall with other nations.
Well, so as we consider the Russia sanctions bill that the Senate is expected to have votes on tonight, Jeanne, in the name of putting pressure on Russia and supporting Ukraine, we know that there's 62 co-sponsors. That means it's going to get through the Senate, but Zelenskyy is likely going to try to gin up more support from Democrats who, yes, most likely by and large want to support the Ukrainian cause, but are concerned that the cost of that is giving the president more tariff power, giving that back to him. How ultimately do you think Democrats will come down as a whole on that?
You know, to your point, Kailey, the 22 co-sponsors are Democrats. It's 62 are co-sponsoring. That is, you know, a win, even if Zelenskyy doesn't go up there and advocate for it. I certainly think all the outpouring of love for Lindsey Graham today and remembering him is going to help. But Democrats have a right to be concerned, because this gives the president an enormous tool that he hasn't had. It's an enormous expansion of power. What Democrats have tried to do is support Ukraine without giving the president that power. And of course, it cedes power from Congress, who controls trade, who controls foreign commerce, to the president. And that's a potential violation of separation of powers. So I think we have a ways to go here. It's also, interestingly, the first time in American history that if this passes, and I think it will, Congress is authorizing the use of tariffs as a geopolitical weapon to punish secondary countries like India, like Russia, like China, rather than as a standard trade remedy. And that's potentially in the long term very dangerous. And that's why there is remaining concern despite support for Ukraine.
Jeanne, Zaino, and Sarah Chamberlain, we appreciate your joining us here with our eyes on National Cathedral. Many more members of the cabinet have arrived, as we have eyes now on Scott Bessent, RFK Jr., speaking with Benjamin Netanyahu. The Interior Secretary, Doug Burgum, has arrived as well, as we approach a full quorum for the cabinet. This memorial service is set to begin in roughly 25 minutes. President Trump is on his way in the motorcade, and we'll have much more on this straight ahead here on Balance of Power. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu. We'll turn our attention back to the war in Iran. And the latest from Ben Jensen at CSIS coming up next, only on Bloomberg.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks continue to push higher. The Dow and the S&P very much in the green. NASDAQ just turning positive, but the NASDAQ 100 index does remain lower. Tech's getting hit hard today. Right now we got the NASDAQ 100 index down 0.7%. A lot of weakness in the semiconductor names as the rotation out of that group continues. The SOX, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Stock Index, now down by 4.2%. So the S&P up 25, up 0.3. NASDAQ, we'll call that now flat on the day, while the Dow is up 628 points. That is a gain of 1.2%. Dow Industrials being led higher by Sherwin-Williams after earnings. The Bloomberg Mag 7 Index up 0.9%. The 2-year 4.27%. The 10-year 4.60%. And the 30-year at 5.09%. Gold $4,030 the ounce. Spot gold down 1.2%. Crude, a major story today. West Texas Intermediate down 4.1%, back below 80 a barrel. 79.26 on WTI. On Brent below 85. 84.34. We're looking at a drop in Brent crude, down now by 4.6%. Visa is up 1.8%. Visa is eliminating about 2,600 jobs to make the firm more efficient as it competes in an increasingly tough payments industry. Shares of MasterCard, the rival, also based, we've got Visa based in San Francisco. MasterCard shares up 1.7%. Elsewhere in the corporate world, Apple preparing to launch new devices and software for the smart home market, including a hub device with the new Siri AI assistant. Apple shares up today by about 0.7%. Recapping, S&P up 23, up 0.3. NASDAQ now lower, down under 0.1%. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right. Charlie Pellet watching the markets for us. Thank you so much. Here in Washington, we're watching the National Cathedral where memorial services for Senator Lindsey Graham are about to begin. Much of President Trump's cabinet, as well as leaders from the United States Senate, are in attendance. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, just arrived. You also find in the audience heads of state from a number of countries, including Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who, if you are joining us on YouTube or Bloomberg TV, you can see right now is sharing a few words with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, after meeting earlier today with President Trump at the White House. We did get a readout of that meeting from the Israeli Prime Minister's office, saying that the U.S. and Israel are fully aligned on Iran and that Israel supports whatever path President Trump chooses. And we heard from President Trump earlier today as he did an interview on Fox News about the potential paths that lay ahead. A diplomatic one, yes, but another that could potentially target Pickaxe Mountain.
Bibi's telling me that because he wants me to stay involved. I mean, I don't necessarily. We have the finest, because of Space Force, we have the greatest cameras in the world focused on. We know exactly what's going on. But, no, I heard Bibi announce that. I said, why don't you just tell it to me? Why do you have to announce it to the world? I know exactly what's going on at Pickaxe. It's not a big problem. We took out their nuclear sites, and we'll have to take out Pickaxe if we don't make a deal. If we don't make a deal, we'll take it out very easily.
Yet another reference to Pickaxe Mountain, which is something he's been talking about a lot lately, with reports based on Israeli intelligence that thousands of empty centrifuges were hidden below some 400 feet of bedrock beneath Pickaxe Mountain. We'll see if we get that far, because the fact of the matter is we have a continued pause in hostilities. It's been since Friday that the U.S. was trading fire with Iran, and there are questions about what motivated that decision and about what might come next, which is why we're always lucky to have Ben Jensen with us. He's in studio in our Washington bureau, director of the Futures Lab, and a senior fellow for the Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This is the man counting the missiles as they're fired and procured. And Ben, it's great to have you back, as always, here on Bloomberg. There was reporting, something I was talking to Kailey about earlier. Admiral Brad Cooper was the one who advised the president to cool it, suggesting that this continued strike against the Strait was not effective any longer. Some suggested that that decision was motivated by dwindling supplies of munitions. What do you make of it?
So first, we always have to be careful about what happens behind closed doors, right? It's like bad high school gossip 50% of the time, maybe 51. So if Admiral Cooper did indeed say that, my guess is what he was really trying to indicate to the president is here are your viable range of military options. And so should you continue to prosecute the war this way, here are the risks the ships will incur because of the interceptors. And I think more importantly, what most people miss is you can't separate the way we fight in Iran from the way we plan to deter China, from the way we plan to deter Russia. Because a lot of the component parts for these missiles are common across multiple missiles. And so Admiral Cooper, given his experience, lifetime of service in multiple combatant commands and at sea, isn't just looking at this in his responsibility as CENTCOM commander. He's also making sure he's giving what we call best military advice to the president, so the president weighs the costs of an additional 30, 60 days of a campaign with an unclear political outcome or transition versus the cost and risk it incurs to deter those other possibilities on the horizon. So
is it fair to say that this isn't about inability to continue potentially heavy operations against Iran? It's the opportunity cost of what that pursuit lawsuit would mean for other theaters.
See, this is why I love Bloomberg. Nowhere else could we talk about terms like opportunity cost. You hit it on the head, right? So it's not, we absolutely have our capabilities to do this. And people forget, in that initial 30-day campaign, there was a period of time where we switched from standoff precision munitions to, we had so decimated their air defenses, we could fly in and drop laser-guided bombs and even GPS-guided munitions. We have got tons of those. So it's not that we can't fight, it's a question of the way you want to fight relative to the military objective. So where a naval voice would be concerned is if I'm going to escort ships through the strait and basically make the oil markets happy again, that means I'm going to have a lot of defensive measures in place to counter Iranian coastal defense cruise missiles, to counter those fast boats, to even counter drones. And most of our munitions are sadly still built to be $1 to $4 million interceptors being shot at a 10 to 20,000, even $1 million. So the cost effectiveness of the exchange decreases the efficacy of the operation. And so that's the real opportunity cost they're juggling. Now, what you're hitting on, I think most people miss too, is that there are actually really interesting ways, should military operations commence, because a pause for me always equals planning and getting in position, that I think we're starting to see. So a lot of people missed how important that Saronic Corsair strike was about a week ago. How important it is that we have Task Force 82nd. So the Army is in the Middle East sinking ships, not just the Navy.
That Corsair is the autonomous boat that we saw in action. We talked about that.
That is cost effective.
Yeah.
If I shoot 3 to 5 of those at $1 million a piece to hit an Iranian sub in the pier that's worth $100 to $200 million, that's cost effective fighting. That's a different campaign structure. So I actually think people are discounting the creativity of ways we could prosecute this campaign. It's just a question of how quickly can we scale up those unmanned surface vehicles. How many HIMARS or PRISM missiles are we willing to let the Army shoot and even the Marines shoot while we're still building up our industrial base to recapitalize the I think it was 96 hours, 5,200 exquisite munitions used.
Fascinating. So we're talking about Iran so far, and I'm sure we're not done yet, but when you add the cause in Ukraine, this conversation gets to be a little bit more complicated. If interceptor missiles are the commodity, that's exactly what President Zelenskyy is asking for. I know they have a license to make them. Do they simply need to make their own, or do we have anything to offer?
I think all the above. I mean, sadly, even if we did get that license, it's going to take a year to possibly 2 to 3 to put that in place. This isn't like an IKEA kit where you and I go home, or if hopefully you're better than I am. My IKEA kits usually fail.
That wouldn't work for me either,
so the PAC-3 Interceptor IKEA kit is not a build it yourself in 1 day, 1 month, 1 year. And it's going to require infrastructure that's targetable by the Russians. So there's a real cat and mouse game. So it's going to have to be developing additional low-cost interceptors. A lot of this is an intelligence game. So you've heard reporting come out now where Ukrainian commanders will routinely let certain missiles through because they can, through intelligence, tell they're not going to hit something of value or a population center. So that means it's less interceptors to fire at the target. And the real bottleneck here is common for, it doesn't matter if it's a Patriot interceptor, THAAD, a Tomahawk missile, comes down to a few key components. So one, ammonia perchlorate. So it's a weird chemical that allows you to have solid rocket motors or small rocket motors fire. We have only one plant in the U.S. that makes ammonia perchlorate. High explosives. We sadly have only one plant in Tennessee that makes the type of high explosives, turbofans. So the things that are working on a lot of the cruise missiles in particular, we got one plant in Michigan. So it doesn't matter how much money you throw at the problem, there is still a massive industrial backlog and supply chain issue that the Trump administration has recognized, but it's going to take us years to work through that.
And yet they've requested a $1.5 trillion defense budget for the upcoming fiscal year. What you're telling us, Ben, is effectively you could get the money, but you aren't going to be able to spend it very quickly because the industrial base isn't there to back it up.
Absolutely. You will get it in pieces. And to be fair, I think, you know, he doesn't do a lot of media, but Secretary Feinberg has really been the person behind the scenes moving this forward. And that's why you have now not 5, but 7-year deals. And so you have to spend now to get the missiles coming online to scale production. But you're right, it's not going to happen anytime soon, which is why you've seen a separate initiative that's really creative of trying to bankroll cheap munition projects. So you've had 3 announced in like the last year. One was the Air Force's was like the family of affordable missiles. It almost sounds like a Honda Odyssey for the family to go shoot someone. But it's affordable missiles. There's a new one, the ground-based affordable missile, so $250,000 or less to shoot a long-range munition that's autonomous. And so these contracts are being structured cleverly to enable competition and allow people to then actually see if we can alter the entire incentive structure for the industrial base. So I have a mix of new players and primes to meet the demand signal in the market.
Wow, really interesting. Ukraine entered the theater in an amazing way over the past 24 to 48 hours, actually striking an Iranian
Caspian Sea
commercial vessel in the Caspian Sea. Are those parts that you're talking about what Iran was delivering to Russia?
Maybe. Mostly what Iran can deliver to Russia right now are component parts for Shahed. So we heard the term Shahed. We've talked about it. The Russians are actually getting more effect out of their own version of it called the Geran, and they're making them rocket-powered as well. So my guess is the Iranians were sending drone components. I don't know, though.
Yeah.
But honestly, the more President Trump can do to encourage Zelenskyy to take those strikes, the more we can do. I mean, why build it when we can buy a Ukrainian one too? They can produce more drones than even they can use in this conflict. So we probably need to start getting more creative more quickly of those weapons pairings matching I'm talking about. Why fire a $5 million missile when a $100,000 drone will do?
Well, and speaking of the cheap drones, do we have a sense, Ben, of how many Iran has left, to what extent they're still capable of building them? Because we have continually heard from President Trump that it's not just their drones, their ballistic missiles, their Navy, all of it has been destroyed, and yet we're still hitting targets, and they still clearly have the capability to at least fire at U.S. assets, even if most of them are intercepted. So what's the actual status of Iran's capability?
So it's so hard to know. I think the president was being genuine, and definitely Admiral Cooper, when they gave the battle damage assessment up front, but that was really striking the conventional Iranian forces and known forces. What Iran has learned from North Korea is to dig, baby, dig. They go underground. So they have entire factories built underground to produce drones, to produce components. And that's what makes it a very huge intelligence challenge. So you never fully are confident you got all of the production sites. So even if you can have an intelligence estimate, say, yes, you destroyed, by definition, destroyed isn't 100%, it can be like 75 to 80. They're still producing more, and because the drones are cheap, they can produce more. We knew even in the initial strikes that we were hitting the launchers, that we never were getting all of the ballistic missiles. What surprised me is the speed with which Iran has recovered the ability to shoot ballistic missiles. So there's definitely some disconnect there that I'm not sure what it is. The scariest one is that Iran also has built its launchers to look like commercial vehicles. So we still believe in the law of armed conflict, so we're not going to shoot something that looks like a school bus, but it turns out it's actually a launcher for a anti-ship cruise missile. So there's a lot of deception involved in this that makes it really difficult to say with confidence what you did destroy. And sadly, Iran doesn't need that much to conduct sea and area denial. They can fire a salvo of 5 to 30 ballistic missiles every month and hundreds of drones every month in intermittent intervals, and it keeps us on a defensive footing. That's the difficulty of breaking that type of defense.
Can I ask before they give us the hook just quickly,
Yeah.
what do we need to drop on Pickaxe Mountain to get that far underground? Is that the mother of all bombs, or is it something we haven't seen?
I don't think a Moab would do it, given how deep it is. I think what you're probably going to have to do is fall back to one of the true enduring truth of special forces. The infinite design of an operation is relative force superiority, meaning it's probably going to have to be one of the most sophisticated special forces missions in history.
Do you put people down there?
You'd have to put an
tunnels?
outer cordon and basically absorb Iranian counterattacks while you have specialized engineers and special forces teams go down and either detonate and collapse the mountain from within or take the uranium out if it's there.
Amazing.
So maybe not as easy as the president is suggesting it would be if there's no deal. Ben Jensen, super smart stuff. Thank you so much for joining us from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu. We'll see you for the late edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.